Hello, everyone, and welcome to our learning session on documenting your API. So this is a two-part session. So the first part that we are going to cover today is documentation strategies, specifically the API reference, your how-to guides, and your sample applications. In the next section, we will cover how users utilize your documentation. So like I said, today we're covering documentation strategies. So the first part of your documentation for your API is your API reference. This is your foundation of your API documentation. And I like to refer to this as your API facts. So if you're presenting your API in some sort of library or package, this would cover, your classes, your method signatures, your method return values, your constants, your enums, your default values, basically anything that you'd expect to see in like a Java package or a Python package. If you're working with a web API like a REST API, this might cover your URLs and your endpoints, your HTTP methods, your request body, your response body, your HTTP response codes, your headers, your pagination methods, and so on. So the API reference, it's very dry. It's very programmatic. It's very like, hey, here's methods, here's endpoints, here's whatever. Here's a brief description of what you have there. However, the one catch with the API reference is that it needs to cover 100% of your API. It's your source of truth, it's your foundation. And I like to say, if it's not documented in the reference, it might as well not exist. Because there's just no way that a user is going to be knowledgeable of the existence of something if it's not a part of your reference. However, despite this, because of the kind of specific programmatic nature of what goes into your reference, there's a lot of tooling out there to automatically generate your API reference docs. So you might have seen something like Java Doc or PyDoc or RDoc, depending on what packages you've been working with. And if you've ever worked with a REST API, you might know about OpenAPI and Swagger specifications. So these are all basically tools that can support auto-generation of your API reference. So one catch with the API reference is that it might be lacking in terms of showing how parts of your API interact, or also showing some sort of non-programmatic items that you need to do, such as like account setup, package installation, credential management. So this is where the next part of your API documentation comes into play. And this is your how-to guides. So your how-to guides are human-written step-by-step guides that show how to do some specific task or use case that's not really apparent in the reference. And a lot of times, as I said, there are things that might be hard to document in the reference. So how are you going to show those? Well, that's how you do this, through the how-to guides. And typically, these how-to guides are written in Markdown. One of the most common presentation of how-to guides is a Readme. So if you ever go to a GitHub page for a project, the first thing you're going to see is a Readme. It might show some information about the project, might show some example use cases. It might show how to install the project, might how to show setting up your development environment. And that's an example. That's the typical how-to guides that you'll first encounter. So the last part of API documentation is your sample applications. So this technically isn't documentation, but I like to bundle it in the same package as the reference and the how-to guides, because I think they're just as important. So sample applications are very straightforward. They're just standalone projects that use the API in a potential real-life environment. And the key point with sample applications is that they show how your API interacts and exists within the native development environment that you may be working with. So if you have an API that is presented as like a Python package, then you might have a sample app that's a Python file, maybe a Flask server, or some sort of script that you run that uses this package. And when it comes to sample apps, I like to think a good sample application is an implementation of a specific use case of the API. So, one sort of trick that I like to think of with sample apps is, what's a how-to guide that I have for my API? And can I show a specific implementation of this using a sample application? All right, so I covered these three, basic strategies: your reference, your how-to guides, and your sample applications. So why these strategies? What's the purpose of this? So before we answer, those three specifically, let's talk about why you want to provide API documentation. And I like to summarize this with a kind of broad answer, saying that API documentation is about making your API possible and easier for users to understand and use. One sort of disclaimer that I've seen people fall into is that your documentation makes your API better, and that's not really true. Documentation is not a substitute for insufficient API design. Some people say, oh, well, we can just document this and that'll fix the problem. That doesn't really fix the problem. That's for a different conversation, but I did want to mention that. So for the three pieces, why do you want to have these reference, how-to guides, and sample applications? So as I said before, the reference is your foundation. You just can't go without it. It shows all the pieces that exist in your API. It may not show them in a easily digestible manner. Ideally it should, but it should at least show the user that, hey, this is something that exists in your API. And then how-to guides and sample apps, they kind of fill in the gaps for items that may be hard or even impossible to document through a reference. They're kind of, they could be thought of as teaching materials. You can use them to highlight common use cases. You can also kind of use them to document how, pieces of the API interact, as I mentioned before, and also non-programmatic tasks like account setup. And then one other thing with sample apps, as I said, they provide runnable examples of the API in the context of, what your users might be working with. So you have these three pieces of documentation. Those are three things you need to work on. So how do you kind of prioritize and say, hey, of these three documentation strategies, what do I need to work on? And just like a lot of things in our industry, the answer is always it depends, except for the reference. You need to have the reference, as I've said before. But between the how-to guides and the sample apps, it really depends on what do your users need. Some sort of questions you can ask to say, hey, maybe I need to work on a how-to guide for my API. Something like, are users running into common use cases or issues? Is there a step in, setting up your API, setting up your account that users are kind of stumbling on and may need some reinforcement on? And, on the flip side of that, you can be a bit more proactive and say, do I want to highlight some specific use case of my API? An example with Deephaven, we always talk about our real-time data analytics. So maybe a how-to guide on that could be presented to, highlight, hey, this is something that we want to advertise as a use case for our API. Prior setup, that's typically a good flag for needing a how-to guide. And as I said before, API interaction is another example, or is another flag for making a how-to guide. And as for sample apps, some questions you can ask is, do you need to show how your API interacts with the native development environment? If you have a web API of some sort, and you're having webhooks coming in and HTTP requests going out, maybe showing that as a Python Flask server or a Java Spring server would be the best way to get users to understand your product. And maybe it could also be, hey, maybe we just need to provide some starter code for our users to use the API. Maybe that's the easiest way that we can get users to understand our product. And again, you can also be proactive with sample apps. Do you want to show off a part of your API using some sort of runnable example? So to show examples of this, I've grabbed some pieces from a couple APIs out there that I think show how these reference how-to guides and sample apps interact pretty well. So for the rest of this session, we're going to be going over these APIs. So let's start with Deephaven. I think all of you know what Deephaven is, but I worked on the listener docs for Deephaven Community Core, and I just wanted to see, hey, does this idea of this reference how-to guides and sample applications apply to Deephaven? So let's start with the reference. So I went into our PyDocs and I found this method. It's called listen. It's part of the Deephaven package, as you can see. And we have a method. We have our parameters right here. We have our two required parameters. and a list of optional parameters. This is Python, so if you're unfamiliar with the Python method signature, if you have a parameter set to a value, that means it's an optional value, and if not assigned, it will take the this value on the right hand as default. So we have this method, we have parameters. We have a brief description of what this method does, listens to table changes, talks about some legacy listeners down here, and then points to listener documentation for details on processing update events. So scroll down a little bit more, we can see a bit more of a description of the parameters. So we see, okay, we have this T is our table, we have listener is our listener, and we have our optional parameters down here. And then lastly, we have our return value, which is our table listener handler. So in terms of a reference item, I think this is very sufficient. It would be nice if right here we linked out to where a user could go, but I think this is very good. It shows the method, it shows the parameters that you can pass into it. It has a description of what the method does, and it has its return type. But within the context of Deephaven, this doesn't provide the full picture. What's the table going to look like? What's this listener that is returned? How do I use that? So that kind of screams, hey, there's pieces of this API that are interacting with this method. So maybe there's a how-to guide that shows how to do this. And sure enough, there is. So what does the how-to guide look like for this? All right, so table listeners in Python. And as you can see right away, this is not this isn't a method type of documentation. This is, a person wrote this as a guide for users to understand listeners. So see a brief introduction, and then we scroll down a little bit and we see some code. So first thing we see is from Deephaven import listen. So we know, oh, this is talking about this listen function right here. And then we see, okay, we have from Deephaven table tools import timetable. So this is where, another piece of the API is coming into the picture. And this is where, the purpose of the how-to guide is being fulfilled. How does the listener interact with, the table? So now we see this listener function, as mentioned in the reference, it has to take an update parameter. And so here we say, okay, we're creating a table. If you're unfamiliar with the timetable, basically the way it works is you pass in some sort of timestamp and it adds a new row after that amount of time passes. So this timetable is going to update every second. It'll update with a column set to an integer value, and then we're just going to keep the last 5 items in this table. And then we see here, okay, we're using the listen function, and we're passing in our table that we just created here. And then we have our listener function that we created right here. So this fulfills the purpose of the how-to guide. It gives a human readable description of how the listener works within the context of Deephaven and the other table that the listener is interacting with. So again, I think this is a very good example of what a how-to guide should look like. And for the last part of documentation, let's show a sample app. So I made this sample app about a month or so ago, the Rss Podcast Sample App, and this app pulls information from RSS feeds that represent podcasts. And I added a feature to this that uses the listener to create a Slack message every time a new row is added to one of the tables of our choice. So the code, you can see the code for that right here in this file. So again, we see from Deephaven import listen. So we know this sample app is using the listener. We have some configuration with Slack. And then we have a builder for our listener function. And then down here, we can see, okay, we are using the listener function to listen for updates on these tables. And so this is an app that it's on GitHub, you can git clone it, you can run it, and it'll launch and do something. And I actually have some examples of that in here. So my personal workspace. So you can just see like, hey, this is the result of running this application. So there's a couple more APIs that I want to look at to show this idea of references, how-to guides, and sample applications. So the next one let's look at is Twitter. So Twitter has a HTTP-based API, and I've been working with their API recently for a sample app. So figured why not use this as an example of what this reference, how-to guide, and sample application idea looks like. So let's start with the reference. So, using a REST API, I would expect a good reference item to have the HTTP method, the URL, description of the request and response bodies, or if it's a GET request, maybe the query parameters, and just see what are some authentication methods used for this, and so on. What are the headers? So I see that here. All right, I see GET, that's HTTP method. I see the URL right here, so that's what I'm expecting to see. Brief description of the endpoint. This searches for public tweets matching the query. And I got the full URL here. Have a little bit of information on authentication and rate limits. And then scroll down more, and I see the query parameters. This is a GET request, so I'd expect to see query parameters. So I just see, here's one example, query string, and then a description, and there's several other more of them. And so one thing that this kind of stood out to me, they actually had an example request kind of in line. It's not really necessary for a reference item, but I just thought that was pretty cool. And I thought, it said, hey, here's a simple curl request that you can do to see this endpoint. And then you scroll down, so you see an example response. Okay, so I see that this is JSON, and I'm expecting to see this data object with a list of other items in it. And then I see this meta object with just some meta information here. And then I scroll down and I see, okay, here are the response fields. Again, I see ID, string, description, text, string, and so on. And there's more that can be added in here. So again, I think this is a good example of what a HTTP reference item would look like. The one thing that I was a little unsure of when I noticed this documentation was the response body didn't quite match what the response field said, and specifically it was this data item. I didn't see this in here. Like, I would expect this to be data.id, because they actually do the same thing with their meta. So they have meta, then they have meta.count. So I thought that was a little strange, but outside of that, I thought this was, another good example of, what a reference item would look like. And then, I looked through their docs a little bit more. I wanted to see, hey, what's a how-to guide look like for the Twitter API? And I found one for that endpoint that we just looked at. So again, starts introduction, paragraphs. This is human written, human readable type of documentation. And one thing that I thought was really cool on this guide is that they started right here. The first thing after the introduction was this prerequisites, and it said, okay, this endpoint is only available as part of this academic research product track. So I thought it was cool that it said right away, like, hey, make sure that you have this set up before you go using this endpoint. And again, I feel like that's very appropriate for a how-to document, because that's something that might be a little bit more difficult to document in a reference item. And then scrolls down a little bit more. It shows how to connect your application. This is some UI, web UI type of configuration that you need to do in order before you can get your tokens and use this API endpoint. And then again down here, it says connect to the full archive search endpoint, and it shows an example of your API request that you could do down here. And last thing, again, I did find a sample application on Twitter. This is a pretty straightforward endpoint, so I didn't expect too much from this sample application. Simply just makes an HTTP request on the endpoint and then prints the result. So, but that's still a good sample app. This is a Python script. You can copy paste this, you can set up your credentials, and you can run it, and it would work. So the last piece that I want to talk about is the TA lib package. This was we had a user in Deephaven wanting to use this package in Deephaven. And so I figured, I was like, hey, I might as well look at their documentation, see how they document their package. So again, found, so they on the GitHub website, or on the GitHub page, I found a link to this Github Io Docs. And, this is just one example of what their reference looks like. Sorry, I skipped over something real quick. This package is a Python wrapper for the base TALib package. So the TALib package is something you would install on the command line and then use through there. And somebody wrote this Python package as a wrapper for that to use it easily within Python. So because of that, it kind of makes sense that the reference docs don't really describe what each of these methods do. Like this just says, oh, B bands, Bollinger bands, here's what it returns, and here's the method signature. It says, go here for the Bollinger bands documentation. And that kind of makes sense, because I don't think it'd be appropriate for somebody writing a wrapper for this library to document how each of the methods work. But at least this reference shows the methods that exist within the package. So again, I think this is a good example of what a reference should look like. It's very dry, it's very programmatic, and it shows you what is present in the package. And then, just for some how-to guides, this is one of the first items that you see on the homepage of this package. So it shows an example, install TALib, and here's an example of calling one of the methods. So talib.sma, pass in your value, and you get some output here. And I did want to highlight one other piece with this package. This is the installation guide. And as I said before, this is a Python package, so I'd expect pip install talib to be the majority of the setup. However, because this depends on the underlying talib package, the author put another section on here to say, hey, here's the dependencies that you need for using this package. So if you're on OS X, run brew install talib. If you're on Windows, here's how you set up the package. If you're on Linux, here's how you set up the package. So I thought that was a very good example of something that you should put in a how-to guide. And I did not find any sample applications using this library, but I think what they have right now is sufficient. Makes for good documentation for the API. So maybe a sample app is not really necessary for this library at the current moment. So I talked a lot, and so I just wanted to recap what we've talked about today. So API documentation comes from three main sources: your references, your how-to guides, and your sample applications. The reference is your foundation, it's your source of truth. It's the base for your API documentation. The how-to guides, show step-by-step process for using the API, ranging from anything from, some highlighting some use cases of the API to, setting up the package or setting up your account. And then their sample apps show, runnable projects using the API. How-to guides and the sample apps are built on top of your reference. So if you're ever in a position where you're saying, oh, I have this really good how-to guide, but I don't really have a reference item for it, maybe you need to start working on the reference before you produce the how-to guide. And lastly, as the API provider, it is your responsibility to know your API and your users well enough to prioritize what type of documentation that you should be providing for your package. All right, so that concludes this session. Does anybody have any questions?
So Jake, can you talk a little bit about what's required to keep these different types of documentation consistent?
Ooh, yeah, that's a good question. So keeping the reference consistent, ideally, if you're working with some sort of auto-generated solution, as I mentioned, like JavaDoc and PyDoc, ideally, those should keep your reference up to date. So if you make changes to your code, like, if you add a new parameter to one of your methods, then ideally that should just be automatically updated, as your API updates. For the how-to guides and sample applications, those are a lot harder to keep up to date because, I'll just use a simple example. Let's say I had a sample application or a how-to guide on using that Twitter search endpoint. And let's say the Twitter API makes a breaking change, adds a new required field. Oh, we have to require timestamps to use this endpoint now. So you're not going to notice that unless you're either one, subscribe to the Twitter API, developer email list, or two, if you have some sort of automated check to make sure that your how-to guides and sample apps always work with the most up-to-date version of the API. So for the how-to guides and sample apps, I don't want to say easiest way, but the most practical way to make sure they're always up to date is to provide some sort of CI/CD infrastructure to validate that those sample apps still work with the API.
Right. Any other questions for Jake? All right. Thanks, Jake.
All right. Thank you all so much. And in our next session, we will cover how users utilize the API documentation through their development cycle using the API.